Chapter 5 The Rock Tower.
That night we made our camp at the base of the cliffs. The high tower of rock was near us, and on top of it was one high tree.
The pterodactyl that I shot was on that tree,
said Professor Challenger. Professor Summerlee, for the first time, seemed to believe Professor Challenger.
But,
continued Professor Challenger,
we still have a big problem. How can we get to the plateau? There must be a way up, because Maple White arrived there. During my last expedition, I explored to the east.
Well,
said Lord John,
we should explore to the west.
The next day we walked west, and we arrived at Maple White's old camp. There we found an indication left by Maple White. It pointed west. Soon we came to an area of bamboo under the cliffs. In the middle of this I saw something white. We cut away some of the bamboos and discovered a skull and then a skeleton. The skeleton had clothes and boots. It was obviously a European.
Who is this?
Asked Lord John.
Every bone in his body is broken.
I know who he is,
said Professor Challenger.
It's James Clover, Maple White's friend. Maple White didn't come here alone.
It's also clear,
said Lord John,
that he fell from the top of the cliffs, or somebody pushed him.
We were all silent. Did someone throw him? We began to think of the possible dangers in that unknown land above us. We continued walking until we saw an arrow marked on the rocks of the cliffs.
Maple White again,
said Professor Challenger. We continued for another 5 miles and came to an opening in the cliffs. There was another arrow pointing higher up. We followed this arrow and came to a cave. There was another arrow there. Lord John had an electric torch, and we entered the cave. But the cave was blocked by large rocks. This was the way Maple White arrived at the top, but now we could not use it. The next day we walked 22 miles around the base of the cliffs and made camp again. Lord John shot a large animal called an agouti for our dinner. We gave half to the Indians, and we cooked half of it over a fire. That night there was no moon, and it was very dark. Then something incredible happened. Suddenly we heard the sound of gigantic wings from above. Then, for a second, in the light of the fire, we saw a long neck, 2 red eyes, and a beak with teeth. Then this creature flew away with our dinner. It was a pterodactyl. We were all shocked, and Summerlee was the first to speak.
Professor Challenger,
he said very seriously,
I must apologize. I was wrong.
The next day we continued to walk around the cliffs. However, we didn't find a way up to the top. Then, after 5 days, we arrived at our first camp again. When we went to bed, we were very depressed. The next morning, Professor Challenger was very happy.
I have found a way to the top,
he said. How? I asked. Professor Challenger pointed to the top of the tower. Yes, I said, we can get to the top of that tower, but there is a gap between the tower and the plateau.
When we are on the top, I will show you,
said Professor Challenger. With the help of ropes, we climbed to the top. Professor Challenger looked at the tall tree on the top and said,
This tree will save us.
A bridge!
Cried Lord John.
Exactly, my friends. A bridge,
said Challenger.
And now, our strong young friend will cut down the tree.
He then gave me an axe. I began to cut down the tree. It finally fell down and made a bridge for us. The four of us then crossed. We were in the wonderful new world. It was a moment of victory. We walked forward a little bit, and then we heard a loud noise. We returned to the edge of the cliff. Our bridge was gone. Then we saw Gomez on the other side.
I pushed the tree down.
He shouted.
You can never get down now. You'll die up there. I am Lopez's brother, the man Lord John shot 5 years ago. Now I can die happy.
Gomez began to go down the tower, but Lord John shot him. We were certainly trapped. We called Zambo, and with the ropes we pulled up some food. The next morning we made our camp. Then we began our exploration of the plateau, which we called Maple White Land. Lord John walked in front. After we walked for a couple of minutes, he stopped.
Look at this,
he said.
These are the tracks of the biggest bird in the world.
Not a bird,
said Professor Challenger.
What then?
Asked Lord John.
A dinosaur.
Professor Challenger answered. We continued walking and came to an opening in the forest. There in front of us were 5 of the most incredible creatures in the world. 2 adults and 3 young ones. They had skin like a reptile. They looked like gigantic kangaroos. Lord John held his gun. The 2 professors were excited and happy. Unconsciously, they held each other's hand and watched like 2 young children.
What will they say in England about this?
Professor Summerlee asked.
I know exactly what they will say.
Professor Challenger replied.
They'll say that we are frauds.
And if we take photographs?
They'll say that they are fakes,
said Challenger.
And if we bring back a dinosaur?
Said Summerlee.
Well then, perhaps, they'll believe us,
said Challenger.
Iguanodons,
said Summerlee.
You can find their fossil footprints all over the south of England. They lived there millions of years ago, but conditions changed. Here, conditions haven't changed and these animals have lived.
We continued walking. Finally, we came to a very large hole. At the bottom of this hole was a small area of water. Around this water were the pterodactyls' nests. It was a horrible thing to see. Professor Challenger went too close, and they saw us. They began to attack us. We were very fortunate to survive. That night, in our camp, Lord John came to talk to me.
Malone,
he said,
do you remember the place where those pterodactyls were?
Very clearly.
It was a kind of volcanic hole.
Yes, exactly.
It had a blue colour.
Yes, but why?
Oh, nothing,
he answered, and walked away.
Chapter 6. I was the hero.
The next day we stayed in the camp. We were very tired from our adventures. That night we heard horrible cries from the forest. What was that? I said quietly.
We've just heard,
replied Challenger.
the sounds of a prehistoric tragedy. Some carnivorous dragon has killed an iguanodon.
Then Summerlee raised his hand.
Quiet!
He cried.
I hear something.
Some giant creature was coming towards our camp. I think it's going to jump into our camp, I said, preparing my rifle.
Don't shoot,
said Lord John quietly.
If it jumps into our camp, it'll kill us all,
said Summerlee.
I have an idea,
cried Lord John. Then he did something incredibly courageous. He picked up a burning torch from the fire. Then he went quickly out of the area of our camp. He ran towards the creature. In that moment, we could see it in the light. It was all covered with blood. A moment later, the horrible creature ran away.
I knew it!
said Lord John, laughing.
That monster is afraid of fire!
The next day, we found pieces of iguanodon on the ground. The two professors examined them carefully.
In my opinion,
Said Professor Challenger,
that horrible creature was an Allosaurus.
that evening, we returned to the camp and began to discuss our future plans.
Tomorrow,
Said Professor Summerlee.
we should try to leave this land.
What?
Said Professor Challenger.
We must explore it. I am surprised at you, Professor Summerlee.
Professor Challenger,
Responded Professor Summerlee.
if we are killed, nobody in London will ever know about our discoveries. We can return to London and then prepare a larger expedition. Now we must leave this plateau.
Perhaps you're right.
Answered Challenger.
But first, we must at least make a map of Maple White Land.
That will take too much time.
Said Summerlee.
There are no high mountains. How can we see all of the plateau?
Then I had an idea. There was a very large tree near us. I can go up to the top of this tree, I said. There I can see all of the plateau and make a map. I began to climb the tree. After a minute or two, I saw something incredible. A face. The face of a horrible red ape man was looking at me. It made angry noises at me, but then it disappeared quickly. I was shocked, but I decided to continue to climb. When I arrived at the top, I looked around. In the distance, I saw a lake. Then I drew a map of Maple White Land. When I came down again, I described the ape man to my friends.
Perhaps,
Said Challenger.
it was a kind of primitive man between ape and man. The missing link. We must discover more about it.
No,
Said Summerlee.
we must leave this land. Now we have the map, we can try to return to civilization.
That night, I was too excited to sleep after my adventure. I thought about Gladys. She wanted me to be a hero. I could go to explore the central lake alone. I could go during the night and be back before morning. I left the camp quietly and walked towards the lake. There was a bright moon and I could see well. I arrived at the edge of the lake at 1 o'clock. I climbed up on a large rock and looked around. I could see some cliffs on the other side of the plateau. There were a series of caves in these cliffs. Now I could see lights in them. So, there were humans on the plateau. I could see many creatures in the lake. One had a long neck and swam in the water. Then I heard the sound of a large animal walking very near me. I saw it. It was very familiar to me. But why? Then I remembered it was the creature in Maple White's drawing, a stegosaurus. When I looked at my watch again, it was 2 o'clock. It was time to return to the camp. I walked and thought about my great discoveries. Then, after a few minutes, I heard something behind me. The sound came closer. I turned and saw that horrible monster, the Allosaurus. I decided to run, but the creature began to run too. He came closer. I was terrified. I screamed. And then I heard a crash. I was falling down into a deep hole, and then everything became dark. I was unconscious for a few minutes. When I woke up, I smelled something horrible. Around me, there were large pieces of old meat. I was in a trap for dinosaurs, a trap made by humans. I slowly climbed out of the hole and continued my walk to the camp. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a rifle. I ran towards the camp and shouted. Nobody answered. When I arrived, I saw blood on the ground. All my friends were gone. I was alone in that world, But then I remembered Zambo. I went to the edge of the cliff. Zambo was still there at his camp, waiting for us. There was an Indian with him. Zambo climbed up to the top of the tower of rock. When he was opposite me, I threw a letter to him for the Indian to take to the nearest village. Maybe he could bring ropes to help us climb down.